Hello everyone, I am ProRM Daddy. Today we are going to see how to perform load test against Power BI report, either in premium or an embed scenario. As you can see from my screen that this is a documentation which is created by the Power BI team, which primarily help us to understand how to run the load test. It's very self-descriptive and there are several real life use case which we can actually test against this particular tool. This is a PowerShell tool. So if you would read through the document, it says that we have some prerequisite to it. As an example, we have to make sure we run the PowerShell as an administrator. We also set the execution policy as unrestricted, install the Power BI MGMT PowerShell module. Then there are further instructions going through setting up the load test and then running the load test. What I noticed is I had a use case scenario from my customer, which basically says that they wanted to test if we are touching one of the limit of the Power BI. As an example, if we go into the search for Power BI Premium, what you would notice is Power BI Premium does describe us about this one, but primarily this the document which I'm looking for. And here, if we scroll down, what you would notice is each capacity have certain documented limit per se. As an example, and in this customers of mine, the use case scenario was this, which is they were using direct query and they wanted to see whether their report would be sufficient for, let's say, a P1 or a P2 or a P3 with, let's say, 50 user or 100 concurrent user. Now, it's a little difficult to simulate 100 concurrent user. And if we define 100 concurrent user, they may come down to, let's say, 100 browser session with different user or different user session. And that's where one way we can simulate that could be this PowerShell tool, which is basically opens up the number of Chrome window and it renders our report. So we can come close to that particular requirement, saying whether our premium capacity can handle that many nodes, and if so, what would be our average page response time? And also, one important question which we want to answer is whether we are touching this limit, which is the direct query live connection per second limit, which we can see is defined by each capacity as 30 or 60, depending upon we have P1, P2. To simulate this, what I did is I actually went through um, a configuration wherein I have a report which is created. The report uses ADX, which is Azure Data Explorer. And since Azure Data Explorer allows us to query using direct query and was my customer's source as well, so I thought why not to use ADX. And this report is hosted on an embed capacity. So if we go into, let's say, my embed capacity, which is if I go into home and copy embedding and Gen2 capacity, you'll notice that I have a generation to A3 capacity. So if we look at A3, we'll find that A3 has 15 direct query uh, limit as an example, which is per second. So overall, what I wanted to demonstrate in today's video was how do we run through this load test, and also after running through the load test, can we answer that question that did we touch the number of concurrent users? And for that, I have to use another tool, I would say, um, and that's another idea which I'm going to show you in this particular lab, or in this particular demo, I should say. So let's get started. Let's see how we can do the load test. So here, I can actually click on this go to file, or I can go into the capacity itself and download this code, download the zip file. I've already downloaded it and moved it into here, which is realistic load test. The only thing which you notice is when we go into the realistic tool or do side-by-side comparison, you'll see I don't have this to file or this to folder, I should say. And the reason for that is something which we'll see in a moment. But how do we get started with the load test? And here, what we can do is we can open PowerShell window. So I can actually go to, in this case, start menu and search for PowerShell, and I can open my PowerShell. If you remember, it was PowerShell 64-bit, which was required. I can bring it here. Since I have moved the file into F drive, I can click on F-colon and then CD, load test, then my folder name is learn from scenario, and then the realistic load test. If I look at the files, you can see all the files. And to get started, we have to first run the setup load test.ps1. If I execute it, it will ask me how many reports do we want to configure for this load test. Now for this, I just wanted to test one report, so I can say one. And then it is going to open authentication, and it is going to tell me which account I should use for authentication. And here I can choose an account and authenticate myself. And once I sign in, it actually enumerates all the workspaces and then says which workspace hosts that. And in this case, my workspace, which I am actually going to use, is the last one, which is demo learn. So I can actually type 11, so that's the index number, and I can select that. Then it says out of the two report, which report you want, and I can select the first report, and that's it. It actually generates certain files and it actually generates certain token. Now, if I go back to my folder from where I initiated this PowerShell, you'd see that there is a new folder which gets created. And this is why I had to delete the previous folder, because what happens is when we'll run the run load test, what will happen is it will enumerate all the folders and then it will try to load all the folders. And why we would require more than one folder, I will show you it in a specific or that specific scenario as well. But if I look at the content inside a folder, you'll find that there is three files here. One is the Power BI report.json. This is a file which is a config file which contains information about which report we want to run the tests for, as well as how do we, let's say, override some of the configuration. I'll show you in a minute what that means. And PBI token is the token which gets generated when we feel signed in. So it actually uses that particular token to run the report. And then this is the embedded HTML, which is basically just calling the files which we have using this, or the report which we have using the token which we have, and embed it into this particular page. Now, if we look at this JSON file, this is the more interesting file. And if I use Notepad++ to open it, what you notice is it actually shows us the report URL. This is the report URL for my report. And then we have session restart and then think time. Think time is if we want to allow some time between each click of a user, because a user can basically change the parameter and read up the report. So do you want to give a gap of, let's say, some seconds in this? Now, if we go back to the documentation, which is here, what you would notice is that this documentation does talk about specifying all of these, as an example, filters can be actually passed. And then we have the session restart. We also want to check a bookmark. We can check that. And it actually goes through describing all of them too. Over here, as an example, it says you can pass the filters or as a slices as well. And then it says it does provide some troubleshooting direction as well. Now, if we go back to our use case in this case, I see that I have a state column which is coming from a table called storm events. So, and then a column called state. And if we look at the different parameter value which is available in this, we can see Arizona, California, and all the other different states which are available in this. Now, one thing could be that I want to basically change the parameter and run the report, right? So how do we pass this parameter in a config file? And this is where we can actually copy that filters from the page which I showed you, and here I am going to use only one, so I'm going to delete the rest of it. And the filter table, and if you remember when I was mouse hovering on this, it was actually storm events and state. So I can actually say storm events and the column name is state. And this is not a slicer, so I can say that this is false. And what are the different values which we want to pass? And these are different state, right? So I can actually start with Washington or Texas. Let's say Texas. So I can say Texas, and this is case sensitive, so because data is the TXAS, that looks good. North Carolina, so I can say Carolina. And then let's say we say New Mexico. NEXICO, I know. And let's test with this one. Should be fine. The next thing which I have to do is actually run the load test. This is where I can hit the next one, which is run load test only. And when you run it, it actually says how many instances of each report do you want to open. And as I was saying, in order for us to replicate the real life load of, let's say, 20, 30, or 50 concurrent sessions, we may need to open that many browser sessions. Now, since I'm trying to initiate this one from my laptop, I don't want my laptop to be overloaded as well and cause the overall performance, right? So in this user scenario, I actually took Azure VM, and then from there we initiated multiple concurrent sessions, and it was initiated from 3-4 VMs. But just to simulate here, I actually can use, let's say, 5 uh, instances of the report. And if I hit enter, now what you would notice is now that my browser, or there will be multiple Chrome window which will start loading, and they are actually loading one by one. And I'm actually bringing them over here. You can see within a tick time of 1 second, each browser session is getting refreshed as well. So if you see over here, we have total of 5 Chrome windows, which is opened simultaneously. And with each browser session, you might see this changing, which is the parameter, or you say filters, which is getting changed. Texas, New Mexico. But overall, this is still testing only the first report. What if I wanted to test my both report pages, because if I go into Power BI, I see that we have two pages, and all that we could see in the test session, it was actually the page one which was getting rendered. So this is where I was talking about the second folder which we can add. So let me stop the load test. I can actually close it, and I can close the individual browser session as well. And now if I go back to the realistic load test, and I can actually make a copy of this particular video or this particular folder, sorry. And I don't need to change the name or anything. I just need to open this. Here, what we need is to add the page parameter over here. And if we go back to our documentation, here they do talk about it. They say that, hey, you can actually add a page uh, name as a parameter over here, and would be a page name. So we can actually say we can add a page name parameter here. Now, one quick way to do that would be if we go back to our report, we could see every time there is a new value, as an example, ampersand group equals to this, and then we go to config equals to this, right? So the ampersand seems to be a separator. So I can say page name equals to page name, but where would I get the page name now? So if I switch back to my report right now, you'll see that this is the report name, and this is the section which is starting with report section is our report page name till question mark. So I can actually copy this entire thing and go into here, and like the comment they have added, I can actually add it, and then we can copy the report section part of it. And I can copy this, and then we can go to maybe here after ampersand, say page name equals the value. And if we go back to the documentation again, just to validate that I said page name correctly, page name is be right. So I just added the page name equals to the report section and group. And rest of the parameter in this case will be the same, so I can save it, and I can go back to the PowerShell window. And then again, I can run the load test. And again, I want, let's say, 5 instances or 3 instances, because it is 3 different filters which we are passing to test. So 3 instances of both the report to be loaded. So you'll see first instances, which is again the first page, second instances with the second or the first page again, and the third instance with the third or the first page again. And then you'll see that the page is getting just refreshed, and you might see that it is also loading now the other report. And you can see Texas, and then within a think time of 1 second, it is actually refreshing the page. Now, over here is what we care mostly, because here it says that the average response time is actually 2 minutes. Now, this is all good. Now, how do we answer the question which we actually posed before, which was, uh, are we hitting the number which was mentioned in the premium capacity, which is per second? And this is where we'll have to use another tool to do that. And if we go back to the Power BI side of it, now in Power BI, if we go to the settings folder, you'll also see this Azure connection, which is where recently there was an announcement to bring your log analytic workspace, which is basically a way to capture the analysis of this trace. Uh, in simple terms, it will basically have all the uh, logs of how a query is generated by the user, and those query will be traced in our log analytic workspace. And you'll see I have this all log easy learn. That's basically a log analytic workspace which I have created for this. And this is another log analytic workspace uh, which exists in Azure. So if I search for log analytic workspace, you'll see all log analytic. And this is where I can go to logs. And for this, I can close this. This shows the history of the query, and the last query which I had is this one. And this query is actually saying that how many direct query event is being generated by the Power BI, and then it is binning them by the timestamp within 1 second. So within 1 second, it actually shows me how many direct queries are generated, and I can actually see that the maximum it is generating is 2, which in my customer scenario, we saw that when it was more, it was actually getting close to P1 capacity, and then they decided to go with P2 capacity because that was giving the